From the JCCF, and yeah, he's a great guy, and I know you guys all love him already. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks, Rick. I don't think it's I don't think it's lawyers instead of police. In fact, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that the police here today are doing a great job. Yeah! We should be grateful that we live in a society where people, even people with contrarian views, mind you, they're becoming increasingly the majority in my view, but leaving that aside, have a place in the public arena to air our views. This is the fundamental, this is the heartbeat of a free and democratic society. And the fact that we're here today exercising that freedom shows that it's still alive in Canada. It hasn't been completely snuffed yet. And it's groups like us that are going to keep it alive. And so I do thank the police. They have a very difficult job to do. I think they did a great job last week with the Million March. And I think they're doing a great job today too. So if you get the chance at a personal level, do speak with them and do express gratitude. I think the building of bridges is essential as we move forward. It's the antithesis to confrontation and anger which characterizes certain groups and which we all have to safeguard against. We can't become confrontational. We have to always believe in dialogue, accept the fact that people have different opinions on things. It's a fundamental feature of a free and democratic society, and we're doing our bit to protect it. And you know, when I look at the group to our left, I don't view them with hostility or anger. I am truly empathetic with many of them who may well honestly believe in some of the views they're expressing. Nothing would please me more than to change the relationship a little bit so that we can actually have discussions on these things. For instance, I look at some of these signs. Trans rights are human rights. Well, who could disagree with that? But we live in a society in which we're allowed to discuss what is the scope of those rights? What is the nature of those rights? Do those rights extend, for instance, to programs being promoted in our public schools? That's a legitimate matter of public interest, and any healthy society protects the public arena to enable an intelligent discussion on these issues. But that evidently is a threat to certain people. Similarly, I see a sign over there saying Soji saves lives. Well, I would like to understand what it is behind that slogan. What is the actual belief underlying that? I accept that the person promoting that message may well honestly believe that's the case. Nothing would please me more than to have a discussion about that. But one of the things that has characterized this tragic direction of the country in the last 5 years is the fact that discussion on these matters has been shut down. It's the nature of a woke culture to prohibit the discussion of certain hot-button, ideologically driven issues. That's what woke culture is. And I say woke, I don't mean it in a pejorative way. I'm trying to describe the cultural changes that have affected our institutions, whether it's the public school system, our universities, our court, our legal system, our governmental institutions. There has been, I've been a lawyer, I should tell you, I've been a lawyer for about 38 years, and I have a particular interest in constitutional law. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I have been involved in a number of pandemic-related cases. And it's my goal, notwithstanding the long introduction, to review some of what is happening in the courts with you. I'll do that now. I'll just note a couple things just on my way down here today. I read this very sad news about Maddie Cusack, a 27-year-old woman who was the vice captain of the Sheffield United Football Club in England, who was used to promote the vaccine program being administered by the health authorities in Britain 2 years ago. She had a commercial, and it became quite widespread and potentially influential with young people, especially. She says, "I'm going to have my vaccine to keep my friends and family safe. You should too." So this otherwise beautiful, healthy, vibrant, inspirational person died on Thursday. Okay, now, I don't know why, but I do know that at some point in time, one applies common sense to the whole cause and effect dynamic. And when we see escalating numbers, we call this excess mortality rates, bubbling up across a vast array of countries, indicating a pattern of such a troubling trend in the countries with the highest vaccine rates, we must start to ask ourselves, if we don't know already, where there's a causal connection. You won't see any discussion of that in the media, not in the mainstream press. In a free and democratic society, we talk about the four pillars of a democracy. You've got government, parliament, where you will have noticed there was no debate at all on the imposition of closures of businesses, schools, the retail sector. There was no discussion in Parliament at all.
Shame.
Leading into and throughout the pandemic on the efficacy and wisdom behind the whole closure.
Shame.
Or in the provincial legislatures. That was silent. So that's indicative of a failure of our political institutions. Another pillar of democracy is the judiciary. And I don't know how many of you are following closely, but we, as in constitutional lawyers asserting certain challenges to the public health orders, have failed in every single province across this country in asserting what used to be the meaningful and powerful and clear fundamental freedoms of the Charter of Rights: thought, opinion, belief, conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and most importantly, freedom of expression. When I started practicing law, I was a Crown Counsel for quite a while and had a great interest in constitutional law from the outset. The Charter of Rights was a meaningful document. It reflected this thing called constitutional supremacy. Any laws that were inconsistent with it were struck down, subject to the qualification in Section 1 of the Charter. But the Charter used to protect us. And over the last 5 or 6 years, the legal system has become, in effect, weaponized against people who are trying to assert their charter rights.
Shame.
So you can talk to the nurses who refuse to get jabbed, who are fired. Now, I'll digress for a second. One of my clients a year or two ago was a nurse who had spoken out publicly about her concerns on the vaccines and how inappropriate it is to force people, to coerce them to be vaccinated. Anybody who's been to medical school or nursing school for more than 10 minutes knows that you can't do anything to people without their informed consent. So here you have a nurse in the public square asserting this fundamental ethical principle that's supposed to govern all people in the medical profession, and in response to her reminding the public and the authorities of this fundamental obligation, she was persecuted by her college of nursing. She was fired, and they tried to de-license her. So, I'll also say this: that's just one professional governing body. One of the other. I'm being given the hook already here. One of the other.
Take your time.
Other distinguishing and tragic consequences of this, of the impact of this authoritarian, intolerant culture that's affecting our institutions, is the use of professional governing bodies to punish their members, to silence them, and to prevent them from speaking out. When doctors exercising their informed judgment conclude that, for instance, the vaccines are harmful, only in a profoundly sick and totalitarian society would they be punished for expressing those views. Yet the professional governing bodies are now being used to do that.
Shame.
Okay? Historically, professional governing bodies established licensing standards and continuing education and matters of that nature. Now they're being used to punish members who speak out.
Shame.
I assist another fellow who's being persecuted by the Law Society of British Columbia, because he had the audacity to act for a father who tried to get an independent assessment done of his teenager before that person was ushered into a transitioning gender thing. And regardless of your views on the underlying gender ideology, the Law Society of BC is now going after this guy.
Shame.
Because on the pretext of certain patently false suggestions, but the underlying reality is they're going after him for having acted for the dad, which was resisting the transgendering of his teenager.
Atrocity.
That's in Canada. That's when I started practicing law 38 years ago. If someone had told me this is going to happen to our country, I would have said, "You're crazy.
Chilling.
This is Canada.
Chilling.
It can't happen here." It has been happening here.
Atrocity.
And it's very scary. So it's absolutely important that we continue assembling, voicing our opinions. And I'll tell you, the pendulum is swinging our way, and I'll tell you why I know that. About 6 years ago, I started acting for this fellow out in Chilliwack. He was a trustee, an elected trustee, school board trustee, the voice of the parents who had concerns about the impact of SOGI in the schools, okay? Now, my role as his counsel had nothing to do with the underlying debate. It had everything to do with his right, and in fact duty, to speak out, to speak his mind. That's what the parents wanted him to do. He's been in front of the BC Human Rights Tribunal now for 6 years.
Shame.
For the views, yeah, it's just appalling. Now, back in 2017 when he first spoke out, he was a solitary voice. If you were here last week, you'll know that that solitary voice has expanded into literally millions of people across this country. So when I say the pendulum is swinging, it is swinging. The other thing I'll tell you is in the courts themselves, I was involved in the first constitutional challenge to some of these gathering and events orders, these closures imposed by Bonnie Henry. And the starting point in that litigation was the court's acceptance of a dominant narrative, this idea that we have a worldwide pandemic caused by this deadly virus and these drastic measures of government were necessary. Now, historically, you had to have evidence in support of this kind of thing. Historically, the courts did not start out with the government narrative and then prevented you from questioning it. It didn't require the government to lead any evidence. It simply starts out with the prevailing narrative, and as a lawyer challenging these things, you've got to fight your way out of that. And that is a dramatic change from how courts are supposed to operate, which is objective, impartial, independent, and require some evidence in support of the facts that determine the outcome.
Hear,
that
hear.
has changed dramatically as well, and that's very frightening. But I'll tell you something, in the last year or so, I do note that judges are actually paying some attention to the requirement for evidence. I'm going to just, so that's why I say I think the pendulum's swinging a bit. Let me just, no,
Keep talking. Keep talking.
$1,000 an hour.
the presence of the rent-a-mob over here is a reminder of why it's so important that we're here.
Right them up.
And like I say, I would very much like one of these folks to take off the balaclava and stop yelling at me.
Yeah.
And stop imputing hatred to me because I care about my kids. And actually have a discussion. But of course they can't do that.
No.
And the whole purpose of ideological thuggery is to prevent debate.
Yes.
It's to shut us down and silence us.
Yes.
It's the exact opposite of what programs like SOGI and are standing for. Inclusivity, diversity, tolerance. These are values which nobody disagrees with, but the values that are completely antithetical to the conduct of that mob.
Yeah.
So anytime you want to take off the balaclavas and stop yelling, we can have a discussion.
They have weaponized those terms.
Now, one of the things I want to end up with, I heard Steve Pellick, who's the lead-off speaker here, who's got more brains in his toenails than I can imagine. In any event, and I didn't know that the vaccinations cause such a dramatic reduction in one's sperm count. My only regret is that Fidel Castro wasn't vaccinated back in 1970. Okay, I gotta go. Okay, but let me just end off by saying this. You've probably all heard of the Nuremberg Code, okay? 1947,
Yes.
Second World War. The international community came together and crafted this list of principles which supposedly would govern the conduct of states going forward. And I'll just read a few of these principles, and you figure out whether or not British Columbia and Canada has come anywhere close to meeting what the requirements are set out by this international convention called the Nuremberg Code. You do not administer drugs to people without their full and informed consent.
Here, here.
Okay?
Here, here.
In other words, you got to know what's in the stuff. And you can't know what's in this stuff if Pfizer has a 75-year lid on the data, okay? So you can't have informed consent, and consent means the absence of coercion. So the starting point in the Nuremberg Code is a principle which governments across the world, BC and every other province, have been absolutely ignoring.
Shame.
Secondly, well, you guys, I'm getting the serious hook here. So look, all I can say is government of BC, along with the rest of the provinces, and we're all emerging at different rates. BC is behind some of the other provinces. In fact, in BC, our healthcare workers who refused to be jabbed are still off work despite the shortage of hospital staff.
Shame.
They won't even hide. This shows a vindictiveness. What happened to follow the science, Dr. Henry?
Yeah.
What happened to that?
Chilling.
Anyway,
Chilling.
There's been a wholesale systemic abdication by British Columbia of the principles set out in the Nuremberg Code. And I'll just finish by telling you that a group of other constitutional lawyers are getting together next week.
Yes.
At the initial meeting of a group called the COVID Crimes Accountability Project.
Yes.
Because we believe we cannot simply let this go without holding people accountable.
Amen.
It's absolutely essential that we scrutinize what took place and hold people accountable.
Yes.
So hopefully we can do that.
Hold them accountable for crying out loud!
Right. So
Justice.
whether our legal system is too far gone, is too far corrupted by the woke ideologies that have had such a devastating impact, and whether the legal system in Canada can be revived so as to accomplish that task, I'm not sure. I haven't given up hope just yet, but I think it's a project worth working on, and I'm going to get involved there. So in any event, thank you all for coming out here. Thank you all for being the heartbeat of democracy, the canary in the coal mine, and thanks very much. I appreciate it.